Hi, I'm Karen J. Carlisle and I'm an author and illustrator of Victorian Mysteries, Steampunk and Fantasy. And I've been a part of the local steampunk community for over 13 years. I'm currently writing the second book in the Aunt Enid Mysteries, a Fey Tale. Aunt Enid is back, but there's something different. Book 2 is set actually in 1920s Adelaide, more on that later. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people and of the Adelaide Plains. I pay respect to the elders past and present and recognise and respect the cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. Right, so we're here to talk about Conan Doyle. That's what you're here for. In 2016, I was researching the Lady Alice mine, now Humbug Scrub, which is just northeast of Adelaide. And that was for a steampunk short story, All That Glitters, for another anthology. And I found out Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had actually visited Adelaide in 1920. Well, actually, I'd reminded myself that he had visited 1920. I was originally going to do this talk for my official book launch, A Fey Tale, but due to COVID, both the book and the planned book launch at Tea Tree Gully Library have been postponed. When restrictions are lifted and adult scheduling has returned to the library, I'll be doing a full talk about Doyle's visit to Adelaide and how it's actually woven into my story. But today I'll be concentrating on the visit itself with maybe just a few digressions. And there's the clock. Sorry about the clock there. I'm doing this virtually from home, so sorry. 100 years ago next week, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle set foot in South Australian soil. On South Australian soil. The reason for today's talk and for this year's Steampunk Festival theme. Excuse me. Most of us know Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as the creator of the great detective Sherlock Holmes. The first Sherlock Holmes story was A Study in Scarlet, published in 1887. What many of you probably don't know is he also wrote science fiction, horror, historical, stage plays, and non-fiction books, mainly military and crime, such as the Great Boer War and the case of Oscar Slater, in which he actually campaigned to pardon Mr. Slater from wrongful imprisonment, and he actually was pardoned decades later with the help of other investigators as well. Doyle actually preferred writing historicals and feared that he would be stuck forever writing Holmes, so he killed Holmes off by Professor Moriarty in the 1893 story, The Adventures of the Final Problem. His readers weren't happy though. So Doyle wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1901-1902. It was in the Strand, and that was set before Holmes's death, and of course readers wanted more. So Holmes was resurrected in The Adventures of the Empty House, which was set in 1894, the year after he died at Rockenbach Falls, but it was written in 1903. Holmes came out of retirement for the story His Last Bow on Sunday the 2nd of August 1914, but the story again was actually published in 1917. The last Holmes story, The Adventures of Shokum Old Place, was published in 1927. It was actually listed as the second last story in the final Holmes book that was published though, and that's the case book of Sherlock Holmes, which was published in the same year, 1927. Doyle's beliefs could actually be found in his writings. In the Holmes story, The Adventure of the Sussex Vampires, who actually wrote about vampires. There's actually a book just come out recently which actually has his story in it, and of course if you've got a compendium you can find that as well. So in this Adventures of the Sussex Vampire, it was published in 1924, originally in the Strand magazine, and Holmes announces, "This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it must remain. The world is big enough for us, no ghosts need apply." So there's little bits coming into his stories there. So Arthur Conan Doyle arrived in South Australia on the 21st of September 1920, almost 100 years to the day. That's next week. He visited Perth briefly, then sailed to Adelaide, which was his first official stop on his 4-month speaking tour of Australia and New Zealand. His visit was actually announced earlier in the year on the 12th of July in the article concerning people on page 6 of the Register, and I might just pop a little thing in there for you to see that. But the tour, however, had nothing to do with his books or Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle identified as a spiritualist in 1880, and that was his reason for coming on the speaking tour. The Victorian spiritual spiritualism movement was a fad through Europe and America during the 1850s. Even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert participated in seances as early as 1846, I think, from memory. Victorians loved a good ghost story, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818 to Charles Dickens in 1846 and Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Doyle went public as a spiritualist in 1916, and he published his first spiritual work, The New Revelation, in 1918, and his second book, The Vital Message, in 1919. So then we get to 1920, and Doyle travelled to Australia and New Zealand to lecture on spiritualism and continued to give talks in Britain, Europe and the US until his death in 1930. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle arrived on the mail steamer SS Naldera at Outer Harbour with Lady Doyle, his second wife, Jean Elizabeth Lecky, whom he married in 1907, and 3 of his young children. And we might have a little pic here, if not. While he visited Adelaide, he gave 2 lectures on spiritualism in the Adelaide Town Hall. The first was on Saturday the 25th of September and the second was on Monday the 27th of September. The first lecture was called Death and the Hereafter and the second was called The New Revelation. A third lecture was announced in the Advertiser on Friday the 24th of September 1920 and that was for Tuesday the 25th of September, and that was entitled, I think, The Pictures of the Physics Phenomena, I think, from memory. Excuse me. Doyle and his family stayed in the Grand Central Hotel, which was then located on the corner of Rundle Street and Pulteney Street. The Grand Central Hotel was built in 1910 on the original site of the York Hotel. It was opened in 1911 and quickly became one of the world's most renowned hotels, with famous people like Mark Twain and other people staying there as well. Even so, it went bankrupt in 1924 and became Foy and Gibson's department store, and after the mid-1950s, when they moved to a new building, it was used as a government building and eventually demolished in 1975-76. And today, it's actually the Hungry Jack's car park is on its site, so you've probably been there, and I'll put some pictures in so you can see those. You can also see a plaque commemorating Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stay at the hotel. It's on one of the posts on the footpath near the pedestrian crossing on the southeast corner of Pulteney Street and Rundle Streets. And I've actually been there and taken photos, so I'll pop those in there too. Sorry. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit. That's why I'm actually doing this from home and doing it virtually, guys. Okay, so the Adelaide Register posted the article Man of Many Parts on Wednesday the 22nd of September. The special reporter met the then 61-year-old Doyle in the lobby of the Grand Central Hotel. After the reporter likened himself with Watson when Sherlock left him to his own devices, he then retold Doyle's reasons for that had induced his beliefs in spiritualism. And Doyle discussed the deaths of his son and his brother in World War II and 8 other people within the family household at the time. So that probably influenced his thinking at the time. In all, I found several articles about his visit and lectures in Adelaide. There's one on the 22nd of September, Man of Many Parts, in the Register, page 7, if you want to know it. 22nd, there's also an ad, and I'll pop that ad in here if I can do that. On the 27th of September, an article, How to Talk with the Dead, was published, and that was a 2-column article published on the day of his second lecture. It described his first lecture as the least interesting part of the series. That's probably not a good thing. Later in October, after he had left on the train for Melbourne, several more articles were published in Adelaide and also one in the Hobart's World newspaper, and that was on the 12th of October on page 3. And it's called Tricks of the Lens, Freak Photographs and Others, and that quoted the Adelaide Register's article about the third lecture on spiritual photography. On the 2nd of October in the Register, again, there was another one entitled Spiritualism, which actually discussed the third lecture and how local photographers had discussed how the actual photos could be faked and whether they were faked. On the 2nd of October again, the Adelaide Mail printed an article, Conan Doyle's Visit, Uninspiring Lectures, and that was on page 2. And on the 8th of October, in the Adelaide Sport, page 5, someone called Gigi, I think that's their pen name, wrote an article called Spooks, and that wasn't a favourable review of his lectures either. And you can actually read them all on Trove, and I'll try to remember to put those links at the end of the video. Well, it doesn't help when the camera runs out of room. So here we go again. I'll probably start up here, I think. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was welcomed to Australia by a letter by the Prime Minister. He called him Premier, Mr. Hughes. The Doyle later wrote that he wanted to understand the country and its problems, which is probably why he did a lot of visiting in the countryside. He visited Hamilton's wineries at Ewell, vineyards near Glenelg, and described the South Australian wines as purer than the corresponding wines in Europe, especially the champagne. So there you go for those of you that drink. He had a busy schedule while he was here. He also attended a small meeting of spiritualists in the hotel sitting room, and there was a bigger one officially in the auditorium as well, I believe. He was entertained to dinner by the local Adelaide doctors. Doyle himself was actually trained as a doctor in Edinburgh and worked as a ship's doctor and an ophthalmologist before he retired to write books. Interestingly, he noted that one of the doctors, an elderly professor, was actually named Watson. I thought that was quite cool. Okay. He also visited the art gallery and the botanical gardens on North Terrace. He had lunch with Sir Weigel, the Governor of South Australia, and that was on the 24th of September, so just near about halfway through his visit. He visited South Australian Museum to view Thomas Belchamber's Mallee Fowl exhibit. Edgar Ravenswood Waite, the director of the museum, was in the Doyle party to the visit to Humbug Scrub as well, so that was interesting as well. In February 1921, Doyle returned home on the SS Naldera and via Adelaide again. Doyle had read about the naturalist and conservationist Mr. Thomas Payne Belchambers in a UK magazine and was determined to meet him. His first introduction to Mr. Belchambers, who owned Humbug Scrub, which is actually one of our earliest wildlife sanctuaries, was actually at the Grand Central Hotel where he was staying. He described Belchambers as a kind-eyed, unkempt man in his 50s with no thought of appearances, but the look and voice which bespeak the gentle soul within. So, obviously liked him. In Adelaide Register article, dated Thursday the 23rd, so 2 days after Doyle arrived in Adelaide, there was discussed the recent droughts in South Australia. Doyle was interested in wildlife and nature, so an article about the drought published a couple of days after he arrived would have sparked his interest. The article described how the drought had affected the Adelaide Hills, including Humbug Scrub, which was in desperate need of funds. In the 1920s, there was just little public interest in wildlife sanctuaries at the time, unlike now. So the visit was beneficial to Humbug Scrub, with several articles published in local papers, some by Doyle himself and by other people, including Rufus, which we'll get onto later. And of course, it wouldn't have hurt in publishing Doyle's visit and his local tour either. Okay, so several articles in September and October were written about or by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, both while he was visiting Australia, Adelaide and its surrounds, including Humbug Scrub, and after he had left to go to Melbourne. On the 24th of September, there was an article entitled Humbug Scrub, Sir Conan Doyle's Fairies. There's the fairies there. An article entitled Mr. Belchambers at Home, visited by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was published in the Adelaide Register on page 7 on the 30th of September. And it appears to have been rerun on page 18 of the Register on the 2nd of October as well. The second rerun, or the second story, was credited to Rufus, which was actually the pen name of Ernest Whittington, a well-known writer for the Register, and later for the Advertiser. Himself was a lover of nature, and he actually went to the picnic up at Humbug Scrub as well. Doyle's penned article, These Things Endure, the Verities of Nature, was published in the Adelaide Register on page 18 on the 1st of October 1920. And finally, on the 7th of October 1920, in the Picture of the Week section of the Register, there was a photo, here we go, a photo of Doyle from his visit to Humbug Scrub in the embrace of a young opossum, they said, which apparently crawled under his jacket during the day. So that's the photos there. You can actually see them. Well, I don't think you can actually see them now. The South Australian Museum did a exhibition on Doyle in 2013 and I can't find that online anymore. So Doyle's interest in Humbug Scrub was possibly driven by his belief in fairies and nature, and during the visit it was reported on the 4th of September that he actually asked Bill Chambers, "You are a man living close to nature. Do you ever see fairies?" And Bill Chambers, of course, replied that he hadn't. There's a bit more to it than that. Yeah. So I first researched Humbug Scrub in 2016 when I uncovered tidbits that I not only used in the short story at the time, but on some other stories as well, and in the current story I'm writing. Yay! And that's when I discovered that, of course, rediscovered Conan Doyle had visited South Australia, Adelaide, and had actually travelled within less than a few kilometres of my own house. So that's pretty cool. Exciting. The Lady Alice mine opened in May 1870, and we now know it as Humbug Scrub. As a mine, it was a successful copper, quartz and gold mine, and it was so close to home, literally just up the road from where a friend's place where we used to play D&D for like over a decade. So that's really close. It's all close. And almost 4 years later, I returned to my research, this time in relation to the Arthur Conan Doyle visit. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote articles about his visit to the sanctuary, and in Australian General, he described his visit in chapter 3 of his book, The Wanderings of a Spiritualist, and that was first published in London in 1921, obviously after his visit here. Several pages were dedicated to Mr. Thomas Bell Chambers and the wildlife sanctuary itself, which he visited in between lectures. His two sons accompanied him to Humbug Scrub, but his wife didn't. Other people that went with him to Humbug Scrub for the trip was Mr. Waite, the zoologist from the museum and the director, Evan Kiffin Thomas, the proprietor of the family newspaper The Register, and his wife. So she was known as Maisie. She went as well, and assumedly a representative of the newspaper Rufus, who's Ernest Whittington, and his photographer William Smith, and Major Alfred Wood. I also read somewhere there was a doctor who went as well, so I'll just check on that one. And of course, in my book, Enid Turner and Agnes Farrow get to attend the visit as well, so there's a bit of a side there. Okay, Doyle dedicated 3 entire pages to Humbug Scrub itself and described the journey there via Mulberry and One Tree Hill. This is what he said about the journey. And of course, it was just after a drought, and there'd been bushfires not long beforehand. We all know about that. So the brilliant yellow wattle was just fading upon the trees, but his swath was covered with star-shaped purple flowers of knot grass, with the familiar home flowers each subtly altered by their transportation. It was wild bush for the part of the way, but mostly of second growth on account of the forest fires as much as the woodman's axe. Bell Chambers came to guide us, for there was no one to ask upon these desolate tracks, and it's easy to get bushed. So that's what he said about his trip up the hill, as we say, to Humbug Scrub. He also described a flying eagle, kangaroos, storks, bowerbirds, insectivorous plants, great ants, not great aunts like Aunt Enid, and he was amused by the dear little possum that got onto the back of his coat and would not come out, which we talked about before. He also seemed fascinated by Thomas Bell Chambers' work in trying to help incubate local malleefowl eggs, and I believe Thomas Bell Chambers was the first one to have malleefowl bred in captivity, I believe, as well. He wrote books on it. Doyle pledged to advertise Mr. Bell Chambers' efforts in the local paper, which he did. Later, he also wrote about the importance of wildlife sanctuaries. He's quoted as saying, "Let the state acquire several blocks round Bell Chambers area, and let the whole be enclosed. Let him be ranger with adequate remuneration. Let the roads connected be improved. All this would be very little cost, but see what you would have in return. You would have a show place with folk come far to see. Excuse me. You would have a wonderful pleasure resort for the people of Adelaide. Finally, you would leave in the very best and most loving hands those numerous birds and other creatures which are seriously threatened with extinction. We know about that. Do this and your grandchildren will extol the wisdom. Don't do it and in 10 years it will be too late. Well, look what we're looking now. So he was thinking about that back then too. The final article I found in Trove was on the Adelaide Observer, page 26, on Thursday the 10th of July 1930, 3 days after Doyle's death on the 7th of July. The obituary for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was entitled Death of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Life of Variety and Romance, ends at 71. It recounted Doyle's creation of Sherlock Holmes, his support for spiritualism, and his visit to South Australia. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle arrived on the 21st of September 1920 to Adelaide as the first stop on his lecture tour of Australia and New Zealand. He stayed for 9 days, visited the local surrounds and humbug scrub and arts and museums, and met local people, wrote several articles, and then hopped on the train bound for Melbourne to continue his lecture tour. I'll finish with a thank you to Francesca Zilio, the manager of the Archives and Library at the South Australian Museum, for a photo that I showed you before and some information. The SA Museum hosted an exhibition on Doyle's visit in 2013. Unfortunately, there's only minimal details online about that now, so Francesca dug into the museum's records for me and provided me with the photo I showed you earlier and some other information, which I also used as primary and secondary sources for writing a Fey Tale, which will be out much later. Excuse me. I also want to thank Amanda and the rest of the Adelaide Steampunk Festival committee for allowing me to do a talk on Conan Doyle today, and I'll be doing one on fairies a little bit later, or Conan Doyle and fairies. We'll let you know why that's in the theme as well. And thank you all for coming and listening, and I will see you later. Thank you. Bye. Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk about fairy doors and fairies and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Who am I? Hi, I'm Karen J. Carlisle. I'm an author and illustrator of Victorian Mysteries, Steampunk and Fantasy, and I've been part of the local steampunk community for over 13 years. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional country of Kaurna people of the Adelaide Hills. I pay respect to the elders past and present and recognise and respect their cultural heritage, belief and relationship with the land. So, we're talking about fairies now. I'm currently writing the second book in Aunt Enid's series called A Fey Tale, and Aunt Enid's back, but something's different. This book is set in 1920 during Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's visit to Adelaide, and there are fairies. Okay. When I mentioned that to the Steampunk Festival organiser Amanda, she rubbed her hands together and started concocting a few plots. And my battery's running out. For the intrepid explorers out there, you've probably found a few fairy doors or two around the Railway Museum this weekend. There are 25 hidden around the event this year. If you haven't found them, you can set out an expedition later to find them, but after my talk, okay? So, whether you found one or not, you're possibly wondering why all the fairy doors and what have they actually got to do with this year's Steampunk Festival theme celebrating Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's visit to Adelaide in 1920. I'm glad you asked. If you attended my virtual talk on Doyle himself, you may remember I mentioned his reasons for visiting Adelaide. Doyle was a spiritualist. The Victorian spiritualism movement is generally accepted to have started in 1848 when two teenage sisters claimed to have communicated with the ghost of a man murdered in their house that they'd moved into. In 1852, this strange and fascinating American import, egged on by Anton Mesmer's experiments and what they called animal magnetism at the time, which was hypnotism, that arrived in Great Britain. Even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had participated in seances as early as 1846. By the 1860s, it was a common belief in Victorian society. In 1887, Doyle began his investigations into the possibility of psychic phenomena and attended seances and consulted mediums, and even attempted to contact his first wife, Louisa, after she died from tuberculosis in 1906. In 1889, he became a founding member of the Hampshire Society for Physical. He became a founding member, and later became a member of the renowned spiritualist organisation, the Ghost Club. And that was founded in 1862 London, and is believed to be the oldest paranormal research organisation in the world. Doyle went public as a spiritualist in 1916. He published his first work, The New Revelation, in 1918, and his second book, The Vital Message, in 1919, just before he came over. In 1920, as we know, he travelled to Australia and New Zealand to lecture on spiritualism, and continued to give lectures in both Britain, Europe and the United States until his death in 1930. In the Christmas 1920 edition of The Strand, Doyle published Fairies Photographed, an epoch-making event. He was also a friend of the well-known illusionist Harry Houdini. They were two of the most well-known celebrities of the Victorian era, and they were friends from about 1915. And they're a seemingly unlikely alliance because Houdini was a member of the Scientific American Committee, Skeptic Committee, and they offered a cash prize to any medium that could prove their supernatural abilities, and he often debunked frauds. But Doyle actually believed Houdini had supernatural powers, even though Houdini denied it quite strenuously. Eventually, though, Doyle's beliefs ended the friendship when the two were arguing over the opposite views of his book when it came out. Houdini's book, A Magician Among the Spirits, which was published in 1924. But why fairies? Well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's beliefs led him to write The Coming of the Fairies a year after his lecture tour in Australia and New Zealand. The book was published by Hodder and Stoughton in 1921, and this facsimile copy is available through Bison Books and was published in 2006. In the book, Doyle discusses the Cottington fairy photos in detail and lays out his proof that they were actually genuine. The scientific discoveries of the Victorian era had changed society's beliefs. The spiritualist movement had become less popular, and Doyle was determined to share his beliefs, which is another reason he went on tour to Adelaide. He wrote, "Once fairies are admitted, other psychic phenomena will be more readily acceptable," and that's on page 98 in this one here. He believed that if he could prove supernatural things in nature still existed, then he could prove spiritualism, and he was actually trying to use a scientific method to do so. Okay. So, the Cottington fairy photos. So most of you have probably likely heard or read about the Cottington fairy hoax. It's hard to say when you've got a sore throat. They're the most famous faked photographs of the time, and Doyle believed they were not fake. The first series of the fairy photos were taken by two young girls in 1917, and they were Elsie Wright, who was 16 at the time, and her 9-year-old cousin Frances Griffiths, and they took them near the village of Cottingley, near Bingsley in West Yorkshire, and the first series was in July 1917. The two girls played regularly near a stream called Cottingley Beck, and it was a really narrow stream running in between some really tall, I think 40-foot steep banks, and they weren't technically allowed to play there. And when they were asked why they kept going back, Frances said that they were returning to see the fairies. Their parents didn't believe the story, nor did the uncle, and so the girls borrowed a camera and went back and took some photos. They came back and developed the plates and revealed the photo of Frances surrounded by a group of 5 fairies. Their uncle was sceptical, but the mothers weren't sure because they were starting to get interested in spiritualism at the time. A second series taken in about August, September showed teenage Elsie with a gnome, and they shared these photos with the family and friends. Their uncle confiscated the camera and no more photos were taken. Eventually, Mr. Gardner, president of the Blavatsky Lodge, discovered their existence, and that was a famous medium of the time. And when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle found out about them, he wrote for permission to use the photos for the Christmas article of The Strand on fairies, as he'd been asked to write an article specifically on fairies. The permission was given, the names were changed, and the magazine issue sold out in 3 days, I think a few days. There was obviously controversy at the time, and eventually they were proved as a hoax. One of the girls actually recanted her story later in life and said they were hoax, but just before she died she recanted again and said that they were real and they'd actually taken them. Okay, the photos are still under copyright, so I can show you just a little thing, but I can't actually put much more. You can actually find them online, and they actually went to auction in 2019 and sold for over £20,000, and that was about 10 times the expected estimate that they'd actually had for the auction. So that's a short rundown on the connection between Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and fairies. But why the fairy doors, I can hear you ask. Can you ask even from here? Well, not long after I moved to Adelaide, I was wandering down Rundle Street looking for those little coins that are stuck in the footpath, you know, as you do, and I saw the most unexpected thing. I saw a small 3D door, about that big, on the foundation wall of a shop. And I actually did take a photo, so I'll show you the photo. So yeah, apparently that's a thing. I found out later that there was also some in Brisbane and various other cities around the world as well. No one knows how they got there. When I started writing my current book of Fey Tale, I remembered that fairy door, and it's actually become a plot in my book, so spoilers. From the sketchy articles I've read and the verbal anecdotes, there seems to have been 7 fairy doors scattered over the Adelaide CBD. No one really knows who exactly or when exactly all those fairy doors were installed. It seems that they first arrived sometime in the 1880s, possibly late 1880s, as a bit like a Victorian sculpture. Banksy, yay! Every few years I went searching for more information about the fairy doors, but I couldn't come up with anything concrete. More recently, I've read of a possible second remaining fairy door somewhere in the vicinity of the Coffee Branch Cafe in Lee Street. Unfortunately, due to COVID restrictions and my health, I haven't been able to get into the city to confirm or deny this. So I can't confirm that, sorry. So if you happen to be in there, or you do happen to find a fairy door anywhere in Adelaide, please take a photo, send it to me, and send me the address so I can go and check it out, because I'm still writing that book and I would like to be more accurate where I'm putting them if possible. So that's why we have fairy doors throughout the Steampunk Festival this weekend, and that's what Conan Doyle has to do with fairies and his book. So now you can actually go out and see if you can find all 25 of those doors. I want to thank Amanda and the Steampunk Festival for allowing me to do the talk this weekend, and thank you all for sitting here and watching me virtually, because I can't be there in person, and putting up with my losing voice. So thank you all for coming, and have a great time this weekend. Bye.